bread and beer. For generations of British people, it was safer to drink beer than water because brewing removed the bugs. And bread, it enriches our daily life. But what have bread and beer to do with the Industrial Revolution?
Apart from hunger and thirst. By the end of the 19th century, traditional farming methods like this couldn't keep up with a population explosion in the cities. The urban masses needed their bread and beer, and lots of it. So, the horses' days were numbered.
Steam engines, the horses' nemesis. They'd existed for decades before anyone tried to put them to work on the farm, because most farming jobs required them to be taken out into the fields.
These were the earliest agricultural steam engines, portable engines. They were portable purely because of the fact that they had wheels. These wheels just bolted to the firebox there. So they had to be dragged by horses to do their work. Then a belt drive would run the saw bench or the threshing machine. But if you dragged them by the horses, you may as well get the horses to do the work. One advocate of steam power said, "It is an insult to see half a dozen horses drag along a steam engine. The sight of 6 sailing vessels towing a steamer would not be more ridiculous."
Steam was cutting-edge technology and had many potential uses on the farm. The challenge, though, was to produce steam engines that could drive themselves to wherever they were needed.
This graceful, lithe, 10-ton beauty showed the way forward, a steamroller. Steamrollers were the first self-propelled, self-steering steam engines. Nobody had needed to steer a vehicle before. Either the horses did it or you were on rails. This employed a revolutionary new device, a steering wheel.
The steering wheel turned a screw that wound chains right or left to turn the front wheel. The roller wasn't an agricultural engine, it flattened roads. But it showed how steam machines could drive themselves around to do jobs, and how they might be able to chug about the farm. Invented in 1871, it sparked an explosion in agricultural technology.
Double yellow lines. Bothered, clamp that. The steamroller was built here at Leiston in Suffolk, at Richard Garrett's Limited, in the 19th century, the pioneering agricultural engineers. It grew to a huge business, employing, at the end, about 2,500 people.
It was Richard Garrett III, grandson of the company's founder, who really made the business take off.
In 1851, he paid a visit to the amazing Great Exhibition in London. There, he saw some fancy new American manufacturing ideas, and he thought they would be perfect for building steam machinery. Richard Garrett III then came up with this, something very revolutionary. It doesn't look much. Looks like a big barny kind of a building. It's the Leiston Long Shop, so-called because of its length. What he came up with was something called flow line production. Parts were brought in and added to the machine as it progressed down the length of the long shop. Similarly, other parts were made upstairs and lowered down and added again, so that when the machine left the other end of the long shop, it was complete. He came up years and years before Henry Ford with the world's first production line. Soon, Garrett's were making all sorts of self-propelled engines for all types of jobs, for home and export, and the men who worked them took their living quarters with them in the travelling van.
At busy times of year, like harvest, a crew of men could work the engine by day and sleep in the van overnight without ever having to leave the farm. Though not exactly luxury accommodation, the van did help maximise productivity from the engine and the crew.
Excuse me, do you know the way to the campsite? No? Well, we'll find it, thank you.
It seemed as if nothing could stop the march of steam power into the fields. Well, actually, the poor old horses hadn't quite had it yet. There was one thing that they were much better at than steam: ploughing. But the inventors were getting to grips with this challenge too.
Horses could pick their way delicately across the field, through the furrows that had already been ploughed. Steam engines would have churned the whole thing up, too heavy, too impractical. But if you could find a way to plough where the engine didn't actually cross the field, you could use a wire. This beast is a ploughing engine by John Fowler of Leeds, and it was Fowler who really worked out the finer points of ploughing by steam, and this is how it did it. Here's an enormous drum. There's 350 yards of cable on that. The cable goes to the brow of the hill to the other engine. This monkey head here makes sure that it coils and uncoils accurately. Basically, it pulls an unpowered plough backwards and forwards. The whole thing controlled by whistles, because clearly they're too far away to talk. As we're going uphill now, you can really see the pulling action of the wire there. Bar tight it is, bar tight.
The ploughs could carve an impressive 6 or even 8 furrows at once. When the plough has been pulled the length of the field, the engines move along, lining up with the next unploughed strip of ground. Then the plough is tipped over and pulled back again.
It's incredibly smooth, all that power. I'm sat on 3.5 tons. There's 24 tons up there and 24 tons down there. It's completely silent, apart from the steam escaping from the safety valve up there. It's an amazing experience.
Steam ploughing wasn't only efficient. The vast power of the engines made it possible to plough heavy, thick soil that had previously been impossible to cultivate with horses. More crops could be planted on more of Britain's land.
You don't think steam ploughing was some quaint Victorian thing. It's only recently that tractors have been able to do this kind of ploughing at 6 furrows. The other good thing about steam ploughing is tractors apply tractive effort to the wheels. They compact the ground. Those wheels are just running. They don't. So all in all, still a very effective way to plough.
To British industrial champions like Garrett's, all this seemed to prove that the future lay with steam. But technology was moving on.
At the beginning of the 20th century, Garrett's made a spectacularly bad call. Unconvinced of the merits of the newfangled foreign imported internal combustion engines, betting instead that the future lay with good old British steam. And they came up with this, the Suffolk Punch. Only 8 were built. It was designed as a steam ploughing tractor. It was underpowered and far too heavy to work in the fields. Unable to cope with the post-steam world, Garrett's went into a steady decline until by the 1980s the husk of what had once been a great company was asset stripped, and now there's nothing left. Leiston had to cope, like so many communities based around a single industry, with the loss of their major employer.
The horses were long since out of a job, especially ones like these Suffolk Punches, stocky, strong and bred specifically for agriculture. They've almost become extinct, and there are now under 300 of them left, which is sad, really. Until you consider the benefits: more bread and more beer. But to really satisfy appetites, the industrialists were going to have to get to grips with how wheat and barley were processed after they'd come off the farm.
Try that, Robin.
Because let's face facts, you can never get enough beer, can you?
Cheers.
This is Cowbourne Mill on the Isle of Wight. Very beautiful, very tranquil. Lovely mill pond, the mill house, the mill, the water wheel revolving at a very musical 6 revolutions per minute. There were 5,624 mills mentioned in the Doomsday Book. But although it seems very peaceful and tranquil, inside it's a different story. Although based on simple principles, flour mills are complex pieces of machinery. And their designers and constructors, the millwrights, were the engineers of their day and constantly innovative.
The water wheel drives through a system of cogs and gears, the millstones housed inside this box. The grain is fed through a hopper down in between the stones where it's crushed.
The water wheel drive is translated by gears through 90 degrees. The water wheel goes that way, this stone goes that way. The grain is fed from the top of the mill and it is administered here by a very clever device. This gearing here acts against this trough. It's called the damsel because it's always clacking. Apparently, as the millers used to say, just like a woman's tongue. Absolute rubbish, clearly.
As the grain is crushed, it's pushed out from between the stones and is collected below via a chute. But it still needs further refining.
Next part of the process was to sieve the flour. Done by hand in earlier days. Hard, dusty work. And by the 19th century it was clear that the old grindstone method could not supply massive demand from the big cities. Time to modernise. And this is the next generation of machinery. This system uses 2 sets of rollers, the brake rollers and the reduction rollers. The brake rollers are groove. They smash the grain up. So the first brake roller in here smashes it up. It then goes upstairs by these elevators. And fantastically enough, that's exactly what they are. They're little tin scoops that grab the grain up. It's sieved. It comes down again to the second brake roller. It's further refined, back up again, and then down to the third brake roller. Then it goes back up again, and then it comes down to the next set of rollers, which are smooth, the reduction rollers. And they refine it much more. So you come down here to the first smooth reduction roller, back up again, then back down to the second reduction roller, back up again, and then back down here to the final reduction roller. So this is a much more complex and refining process and could produce 2.5 times what the next door water-driven grindstone process could produce.
This is the first ever industrial food processing system. It needed no human intervention. What's more, the roller mill could produce the extra refined white flour, the preferred choice of the Victorian upper classes. Poor people ate the less refined brown stuff, you see. Next up for modernising, though, the water wheel.
The end for Colborne's beautiful water wheel finally came when it could no longer cope with the demands of the roller mill, so it was replaced by an engine, a steam engine. This is a gas engine, itself a replacement for the steam engine. But cheer up, because it's a beautiful piece of machinery. Close the sluice, please. You ready, Neil? There we go.
Colborne Mill, nestled in rural West Wight, serviced its surrounding farms. It was just the right size for the confined space of the island, which is why it survived. But back on the mainland, Mills of Carborn size gradually gave way to bigger and bigger mills, and the grain they processed came from further and further afield.
And this is where the new mills were sited, in the burgeoning new ports. Not only did they bring grain from further and further inland, they brought it from overseas. Britain could no longer feed her expanding industrial city population, and grain was brought from America, Canada, Argentina and Australia.
But bread was still baked by local bakers. We were still a long way from today's factory-style processing of food and drink. And to see how we got there, we need, pleasantly enough, to turn to beer.
Traditionally, brewing was something you did at home, like baking your own bread. You combined malted barley, hops and water, fermented them together, and that gave you beer. Everybody did it. Every house, every farm had a brew house. They produced their own beer. Some people, inevitably, were better at this homebrew business than others. And some brewers started to think commercially.
In villages across the country, brewers began brewing in bigger volumes. They sold through a network of local pubs where every man, woman and child could get healthy, bacteria-free beer.
Absolutely dreadful. One such brewer, a farmer called John Harris, built a brewery on this side, here in Hook Norton. His business went well. He found the water here very good for brewing. And in 1872, he built a 3-storey brewery. His son, also called John Harris, joined the firm, and it expanded. And in 1895, they built this, a state-of-the-art brewery. And it is still operated by the original steam engine. You can tell it's a proper working engine. It's not the cleanest of engines I've ever seen.
In its authentic Victorian condition, Hook Norton Brewery shows us how 19th century brewers pioneered factory-style processing, from raw materials to finished beer. A Cotswold village like Hook Norton might seem a slightly out-of-the-way place now, but the Harrises knew what they were doing. There were plenty of thirsty characters around, working in the local quarries or building the railway nearby. This ready market justified investing in a building that took 3 years to complete. In Harris's cutting-edge tower design, water and malted barley are first lifted to the top of the building before gravity takes over.
What, you may ask, is a piece of agricultural machinery, 1899 piece of agricultural machinery, mark you, doing at the top of the brewery? This is the very top of the building. Well, what happens here is the malted barley is turned into grist. That's grist. Cracked malted barley. Here, these rollers do the necessary business, hence the phrase grist to the mill. The grist is then sent downstairs, dropped downstairs to be mixed with water in the mash tun. Here's the mash tun. Inside this vessel occurs the first of the magical processes of brewing. Keep the heat in. It's left in here for 2 hours, and the resultant liquid, the wort, is then run off again by gravity. The wort is then piped into this copper vessel. It's called a copper. And when it's full, the next magic ingredient is added. Hops. Here are the hops. All English, you'll be pleased to know. From the old hop-growing areas. Kent, Hereford. But the best of them, of course, like your own dear presenter, are from Worcestershire.
The liquid is boiled to kill all the bugs and infuse the taste of the hops, and then it's let down below where the hops are strained out. Then more pumps come into play to lift the liquid up again to the cooling tank.
Up here, right at the top of the building, The wort is cooled in this. It's called a cool ship. Comes from the German, doesn't mean it's a boat. It then goes back down the brewery for the most important part of the process. Up till now, this brew is missing a crucial ingredient, alcohol. The name of this room might give you a clue as to what's happening here. This is the fermenting room. I'll get me rousing pole here. It's a bit cold outside, so this brew needs a bit of help. Needs some oxygen through it to help the yeast that's been added, you can see it here, turn the sugar in the wort into alcohol. It's Tuesday today, and this will be ready by Friday. Are you sure?
After a few days, the yeast crust is skimmed off through this scoop.
That is fascinating. I have never seen that. That's absolutely extraordinary. It's alive.
Then the beer is siphoned off, put into barrels, and off it goes to the pubs.
They got the design of this brewery so right, it's still in use today. And the brewers got the product right as well. They got clarity and consistency. They also worked out their distribution properly. They invented a beer called India Pale Ale that was designed to stand the trip to India. And that model of central industrial production with good standards and good distribution is the model we use today for global distribution of food and drink.
This brewery is a hangover from an earlier age. When it was built, there were hundreds of independent brewers across the country. Now, just a handful survive, keeping traditions alive. Hook Norton still use a traditional horse-drawn dray to deliver to the nearby pubs.
The production of bread and beer were industrialised, centralised and mechanised in response to the urgent need to feed an expanding urban population. And nowadays, we don't necessarily think that that was the best way. With a series of health scares and constant debate about the actual quality of mass-produced processed food, it's hard not to feel nostalgic for the old days. Cheers. Couldn't drink more than about 9 pints of that.